Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 22, verses 15 through 25 in our continuing study of the Old Testament prophets. Our passage opens in verse 15. Thus says the Lord God of hosts, come, go to the steward, to Shebna, who is in charge of the royal household. Now, this individual, Shebna, is a VIP in the court of the king. And what's interesting, we've actually found at Lachish, is one of those royal cities to the southwest of Jerusalem. Back in the 1960s, a bulla, that is a little piece of clay, and into it had been stamped a seal. This seal says it belonging to Shebna Yahu, servant of the king. So it looks like archaeologists do believe that this seal belonged to the same Shebna who was in charge of the royal household, who was a certain, when I say servant, think of public servant. Doesn't mean he was a slave. It means he was a VIP, somebody who would have a seal in charge of the royal household. Now, an earlier find, going back to the 1800s, was a tomb inscription. This tomb inscription was in Silwa, in the Silwa village. It's located on the southern slopes of the Mount of Olives. If you stand in David's city, the oldest part of Jerusalem, and you look to the east, you see on the southern slopes of the Mount of Olives this community, this little tiny village. It's really built up today. It's got all the, I don't know if I call them apartment buildings or high rises. Uh, and this tomb inscription was thought to be the tomb of Shebna. Here's the inscription. It says, this is, and notice part of it's missing, the name Shebna, but it has the ending of a name. So they believe it says Shebna Aya, the royal steward. There is no silver or gold here, only, and again, there's a part that's missing. They're assuming it refers to his body or his bones, something like that. And the bones of his maidservant with him, cursed be the man who opens it. So, in other words, it was a tomb there. And we're going to see that the passage speaks of where Shebna had placed his own tomb. So let's look at this. Verse 16, what right do you have here, and whom do you have here, that you have hewn a tomb for yourself here? You who hew a tomb on the height is that area to the east of Old City of Jerusalem. You who hew a tomb on the height, who carve a resting place for yourself in the rock. Verse 17, behold, the Lord is about to hurl you headlong, O man, and he is about to grasp you firmly and roll you tightly like a ball, to be cast into a vast country. There you will die, and there your splendid chariots will be. Your shame, you shame of your master's house. Here's somebody who had frankly gotten a little bit too big for himself. He had tried to take for himself royal honors. He was, after all, a public servant. He was a VIP. He was somebody in the court of the king that had a high and lofty position, and perhaps it sounds like he had let it go to his head. And he had taken for himself honors that were not due to him. And now God gives a warning that if you go about this, I'm going to bring you low. Verse 19, I will depose you from your office, and I will pull you down from your station. Verse 20, then it will come about in that day that I will summon my servant Eliakim. So notice Shebna is going to be out, and Eliakim, the son of Hilkiah, is going to replace him. Now, this is a warning. Now, sometimes warnings can be conditional. In other words, if you don't change what you're doing, is it conditional? Is it unconditional? Did Shebna change? Did he not change? I don't want to say because I wasn't there. Verse 21. But here I'm going to summon my servant Eliakim, verse 21, and I will clothe him with your tunic and tie your sash securely about him. I will entrust him with your authority, and he will become a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Verse 22, then I will set the key of the house of David on his shoulder. Now, a key, and notice what the key does. When he opens, no one will shut. When he shuts, no one will open. Now, that idea of a key, not just placed on his hand, but placed on his shoulder. This idea of the key, a key, of course, unlocks something. But remember, this isn't just somebody, any old person. This is a VIP, somebody who has access to the king. So the key unlocks and it grants access not merely to a house, but to the house of the king. Notice, I'll set the key of the house of David. Now, David was long since dead, but the house of David is what you called the kings of Judah. And of course, it was the royal steward, it was the servant of the king that would have the authority to grant access to the king. And so this is figurative language for granting access to the king. If you went to see the king, you had to go through the royal steward. You had to go through the servant of the king. You had to see him first, and either he would let you in or he would say, no, the king is too busy, he can't see you. And so notice the one that gives access is the one who has the key. Now remember that, because we're going to come back to that. Verse 23, I will drive him like a peg in a firm place, and he will become a throne of glory to his father's house. So notice, this is going to, remember, this is in an honor and shame culture. And so this is going to give honor both to the king's house, but also to his own house. Because, if you're a VIP, then those related to you are also increased in their honorable status. Remember, this is an honor and shame culture in the ancient world. Verse 24, so they will hang on him all the glory of his father's house, offspring and issue, all the least of vessels, from bowls to all the jars. And the symbolism here is like you're going to be the thing on which all these important items hang. And of course, the way you would do that in an ancient house, you'd put a peg, you'd place that. You're going to be the peg. You're going to be the linchpin. You're going to be that on which all of these important issues now hang. Verse 25, in that day, declares the Lord of hosts, the peg driven in a firm place will give way. So notice how everything was good until you get to verse 25. But now the peg is going to break. Notice it will even break off and fall, and the load hanging on it, all those things that were hanging on his every word and on his every deed and bringing glory into the family, even those will break, the load will break off, the load hanging on it will be cut off, for the Lord has spoken. Now, verse 25 is a little puzzling and has puzzled Bible scholars. Is this still referring to Eliakim, or are we back to Shebna? And actually, scholars have been a little bit divided. And so you say, well, which is it? And my answer is, I'm not sure. The one that he'd just been speaking of is Eliakim, this replacement for Shebna. But the overall context suggests, well, maybe we're going back to Shebna, how he will fall and Eliakim will take his place. Which is it? I'm not sure, but I do want to take us to the New Testament, where we have a better peg, one that doesn't fall, one that will not be broken off. I'm referring, of course, to Revelation chapter 3 and verse 7. This is one of those 7 letters to the 7 churches in the book of Revelation. And chapter 3, verse 7, to the angel of the church in Philadelphia write. And now we have the introduction of the one writing the letter. And the one writing the letter, of course, is Jesus. And he writes these 7 letters to 7 churches. And in each case, he begins by introducing himself, more often than not, with a reference to the Old Testament. And that's what happens here. Verse 7, he who is holy, of course, that's Jesus, who is true, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, and who shuts and no one opens, says this. And we're not going to get into the passage of what he says, but I want to look at the title. That Jesus is the one who has the key of David. What does that mean? It means he gives access. To whom? Remember, the steward was the one who gave access to the king, but Jesus is the king, and yet he gives access to the Father. He is the one who gives access to God. No one comes to God except through him. And if you come to him, you find yourself with access to the very God of gods. He has the key of David.